Let me ask you a very simple question. Why do you think that a fish sitting in water barely above freezing wants to chase down a meal the size of a cheeseburger? It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, does it not? Yet 99% of fishermen out there are doing exactly this. They bundle up, head out to the freezing lake, and tie on the exact same massive lures they were throwing in the middle of July, and then they sit there freezing their toes off, blaming the weather, blaming the wind, and blaming the moon phase for not getting a single bite. But I promise you it is not the moon, it is the giant piece of plastic hanging on the end of your line. Today we are going to uncover the uncomfortable truth about cold water fishing. I am going to show you exactly why your summer baits are completely ruining your winter fishing trips, and how a massive change in your mindset will have you catching fish while everyone else is packing up their trucks to go home. Tell me in the comments right now, what is the biggest bait you stubbornly try to use in the winter? Let us set the stage here. Fishing in the winter is already tough enough. You are fighting the elements, the wind is cutting right through your jacket, and your guides are freezing up with ice every 3 casts, but the biggest battle is actually happening underwater. There is a deeply ingrained stubbornness in the fishing community. A lot of guys who have been fishing for 20 or 30 years live by the old saying that big bait equals big fish. And in the summer, when the water is warm and fish are highly aggressive, that absolutely holds true. But guys get attached to their confidence baits. They remember that one massive bass or walleye they caught in August on a huge crankbait or a gigantic swim bait, and they refuse to put it away. They drag those same heavy, bulky, aggressive lures into December, January, and February. They do the same thing year after year, trip after trip, completely ignoring the fact that the underwater world has entirely transformed. The environment has changed, but their tackle box has not. Picture this exact scenario. It is 7 in the morning. The frost is thick on the windshield of your truck, and your breath hangs in the freezing air like thick, white smoke. You walk down to the edge of the water or step out onto the hard water, your boots crunching loudly in the dead silence of the morning. You open your tackle box, your fingers already feeling stiff from the cold chill. Out of pure habit, your hand immediately reaches for a huge 5-inch heavy action swim bait. Or maybe it is a massive heavy metal spoon that flashes aggressively. You tie it on, make a huge cast, and begin to work it through the dark, icy water. You wait, you jig, you reel. Nothing happens. An hour goes by, then 2 hours. The sun comes up, but the warmth does not reach you. You start questioning if there are even any fish left in this lake. But the reality is the fish are right there, looking right at your bait. They are simply watching it pass by, completely uninterested in spending their precious winter energy on something that large and aggressive. Your stubborn morning routine is exactly what is keeping your live well totally empty. To truly understand why you are failing, we need a quick, simple lesson in fish biology. You see, unlike us, fish are cold-blooded creatures. Their body temperature is directly controlled by the environment around them. When you are standing on the bank in freezing weather, your body burns extra calories to keep your internal temperature warm. But a fish does not do that. When the water temperature drops down into the 30s and 40s, the internal temperature of that fish drops right along with it. And when a fish gets cold, every single biological process inside its body violently slows down. Their heart rate drops, their breathing slows, but most importantly, their metabolism practically grinds to a complete halt. In the middle of summer, a fish might digest a meal in just a few hours and be hungry again. In the dead of winter, it might take them 3, 4, or even 5 entire days to fully digest a single small minnow. Their stomachs are simply not processing food, so when you throw a giant summer meal in front of them, their biological alarm bells ring, telling them they literally cannot digest it. Let us talk about that famous old rule that says big bait always equals big fish. This is the exact myth that ruins so many winter fishing trips. We have all heard it from our fathers and our grandfathers. If you want to catch the monster of the lake, you have to throw a bait big enough to tempt him, But in cold water, this logic is completely backward. Imagine you have just finished a massive, heavy Thanksgiving dinner. You are completely stuffed, sitting on the couch, barely able to move. If someone walks into the room and offers you a giant greasy pizza, you are going to feel sick just looking at it. You will wave it away. But if someone sets a single tiny peanut or a small piece of chocolate on the table next to you, you might just casually reach over and eat it without thinking. That is exactly how a massive trophy fish feels in the middle of winter. They are incredibly lethargic. They do not want the pizza. They want the peanut. Forcing a massive meal into their face will only make them slowly turn around and swim away into the dark water. I want you to really visualize the underwater scene when you cast a large summer bait in the winter. Down in the depths, the water is shockingly cold, dark, and still. A nice, heavy walleye or a big bass is suspended just off the bottom, hovering there completely motionless to conserve energy. Its fins are barely moving. Suddenly, a massive, heavy vibration rips through the water column. A huge chunk of plastic or metal comes rocketing past their face, displacing tons of water and creating a massive acoustic signature. In warm water, this triggers an aggressive predatory instinct. The fish would turn and completely smash it. But right now, in the freezing cold, that massive vibration does not say food. It says danger. It says chaos. The lethargic fish gets spooked by the aggressive intrusion into its quiet winter zone. Instead of triggering a feeding response, your huge summer bait triggers a slow, lazy retreat. You have effectively cleared out the very fish you were trying so desperately to catch, all because your presentation was simply far too loud and far too big. Fishing in the winter all comes down to a very strict game of caloric math for the fish. It is an equation of energy expenditure versus energy reward. Because their metabolism is moving at a snail's pace, every single movement a fish makes in cold water costs them heavily. If a fish decides to dart forward and aggressively attack a large, fast-moving bait, it burns a massive amount of stored energy. If they miss that bait, or if that bait turns out to be a piece of plastic that they spit out, they have just burned calories they cannot easily replace. Instinctively, fish know this. Mother Nature has hardwired them to survive the harsh winter by moving as little as humanly possible. Therefore, they will absolutely refuse to chase down a big, fast meal. The math simply does not add up for them. They are calculating the risk. Why sprint across the bottom of the lake to grab a giant meal that requires huge effort when they can just sit perfectly still and wait for a microscopic, helpless piece of food to practically float right into their mouth with zero effort? This brings us to the absolute magic of downsizing your gear. When the frost hits and the water temperatures plummet, less is absolutely more. We are talking about switching from those 4 and 5-inch plastics down to tiny micro jigs, 1-inch plastics, or incredibly small spoons. When you tie on a bait that is no bigger than the fingernail on your pinky finger, you completely change the dynamic of your presentation. You are no longer offering the fish a massive, intimidating meal. You are offering them a helpless, freezing, dying insect or a tiny, struggling fry. A bait this small barely displaces any water. It falls slowly. It does not look like a threat. It looks like an incredibly easy snack that requires zero energy to capture. Even the largest, oldest, wisest fish in the entire lake will casually suck in a micro jig if it passes right by its nose. By downsizing, you remove the biological barrier that stops cold water fish from biting. You make the meal so small and so easy that they simply cannot find a reason to say no. Now let us tackle the real problem here, and that is your ego. Let us be brutally honest for a second. A lot of grown men, guys who are 35, 40 or 50 years old, absolutely hate tying on tiny baits. There is a psychological barrier. You sit there looking at this tiny piece of lead and a sliver of plastic, and you feel ridiculous. You think to yourself, I am out here to catch a trophy, not a 3-inch bluegill. You worry that using micro baits is somehow beneath you, or that your fishing buddies will laugh at your setup. But let me tell you what is truly ridiculous. Sitting in the freezing cold for 8 straight hours without catching a single fish just to protect your ego. The biggest, meanest fish in the water eat tiny food in the winter, period. Once you swallow your pride and accept that a massive bass or a huge crappie will gladly inhale a bait the size of a tic-tac, your catch rate will absolutely skyrocket. Put the ego away, put the giant lures back in the deep storage of your tackle box, and embrace the micro game. Let us talk more about the concept of the easy snack. In the dead of winter, the natural forage in a lake or river looks completely different than it does in July. The massive schools of large, fast-moving baitfish have mostly died off, moved to extreme depths, or become incredibly lethargic themselves. What is left roaming around the strike zones are often tiny aquatic insects, small larvae, and minuscule forage that are struggling to survive the cold. By throwing a giant summer bait, you are actually presenting something highly unnatural for that time of year. A large, aggressively swimming crankbait in 38-degree water looks totally out of place to a resident fish. However, a tiny speck of a bait barely quivering on a light wire hook perfectly mimics the dying, microscopic life that actually exists in those freezing conditions. You are matching the hatch, but more importantly, you are matching the mood of the environment. You want your bait to look helpless, cold, and easy to capture, exactly like the real food they are occasionally snacking on. Downsizing is not just about the bait itself, it is a complete system overhaul, starting with your line. You cannot tie a tiny 1/32 ounce micro jig onto heavy 15-pound fluorocarbon or thick braided line. Big summer baits require heavy line, but in the winter, that heavy line is a massive red flag. Winter water is often much clearer than summer water because the algae blooms have completely died off. Visibility is extremely high. If you try to fish a small bait on thick, stiff line, the fish will see the cable attached to your lure from 5 feet away. Furthermore, thick line ruins the delicate, natural action of a tiny bait. The stiff memory of heavy line makes a small plastic look completely unnatural in the water. To make this work, you have to downsize your hardware. We are talking about dropping down to 2-pound, 3-pound, or maybe 4-pound test line. Ice fishing line or incredibly thin fluorocarbon is absolutely mandatory. This invisible connection is what fools wary, slow-moving winter fish into thinking your tiny offering is completely untethered. Another massive factor that ruins winter fishing with summer baits is the drop rate. Heavy summer baits plummet to the bottom like a rock. In warm water, a fast-falling bait triggers a reaction strike. A bass sees it flash by and instantly dives to pin it to the bottom. But in cold water, a fast-falling bait just disappears before the lethargic fish can even process what happened. They are not going to aggressively dive bomb a bait falling at 3 feet per second. When you downsize to tiny, light weights, you dramatically alter the sink rate. A tiny piece of plastic on a light wire hook will drift and slowly flutter down through the water column. It takes agonizingly long to reach the bottom. And that is exactly what you want. That slow, hanging, hovering fall gives the cold fish plenty of time to notice it, analyze it, slowly swim over to it, and gently open its mouth. The slow fall is the absolute trigger for winter fish. Big baits just crash to the bottom while small baits glide into the danger zone. Let us look at a real-world scenario out on the ice or standing on the snowy bank. Imagine two guys fishing exactly 10 feet apart. Guy A is stubbornly jigging a huge, heavy metal spoon. He is lifting his rod high, ripping it through the water, creating tons of flash and vibration. Guy B is sitting quietly, holding his rod perfectly still, barely twitching a tiny tungsten ice jig tipped with a single spike. Guy A is making a massive commotion, drawing fish in from a distance because of the noise. But when those fish get close, they see the giant metal spoon darting aggressively and they completely freeze. They refuse to bite it. But right next door, those same fish slide over to Guy B. They see that tiny, helpless, motionless dot in the water. It looks like an easy meal that requires zero effort. Guy B catches fish after fish, pulling them up through the ice or onto the bank, while Guy A stands there cursing his luck. entirely unaware that he is actually acting as the dinner bell for Guy B's tiny presentation. We also have to talk about how fish use their senses of scent and taste in cold water. In the summer, a fish might smash a lure so hard and fast that it is hooked before it even realizes it just bit a piece of plastic. In the winter, everything is in slow motion. A fish will often slowly swim up to your bait and literally just put its nose right against it. They might even bump it with their closed mouth to see how it reacts. If you are using a large, bulky summer bait, the moment they bump that hard, unnatural plastic, they are gone. But when you are using a microscopic presentation, especially if you add a tiny piece of real live bait like a wax worm or a maggots, the dynamic changes entirely. The bait is so small that when they move in to sniff it, they end up accidentally inhaling it. The tiny profile combined with a natural scent profile means that even the most skeptical, slow-moving fish will gently flare its gills and suck the tiny bait right in. You bypass their skepticism completely. Now we need to address the actual bite itself. If you are expecting those aggressive, rod-jerking summer slams in the dead of winter, you are going to be severely disappointed. A winter bite is rarely a hard hit. Most of the time, it feels like your lure just got slightly heavier or like you snagged a wet autumn leaf. Sometimes your line just goes slightly slack. If you are using a big, heavy summer bait, you will literally never feel this happen. The heavy weight of the lure completely masks the delicate, barely noticeable nibble of a cold water fish. They can inhale a big piece of a large plastic worm, realize it is fake, and spit it out before you even realize a fish was there. By downsizing to tiny, lightweight baits, you remove all that dead weight from your line. Suddenly you can feel absolutely everything. When a sluggish fish merely breathes on a tiny tungsten jig, that slight change in pressure travels straight up your thin line and into your hands. You feel the microscopic strikes that you were previously missing all day long. Because the bite is so subtle and your bait is so small, you absolutely must rethink your fishing rod. Throwing micro baits requires the right stick in your hand. You cannot take the heavy, stiff bait casting rod you used for flipping heavy jigs into summer grass and use it for tiny winter plastics. Fishing a 1/32 ounce bait on a heavy broomstick rod is a complete nightmare. You cannot cast it, you cannot feel the bottom, and you definitely cannot feel a subtle bite. You need to switch to an ultralight or a light power rod with an extremely sensitive, soft tip. A soft tip allows you to impart tiny, microscopic twitches to the bait without moving it too far out of the strike zone. Furthermore, when a lethargic cold water fish bites, you do not want them feeling the stiff resistance of a heavy rod. A soft tip allows them to slowly suck the tiny bait in without feeling any unnatural tension. If they feel tension, they spit the hook. The right rod turns a frustrating day into a highly successful, controlled presentation. Let us discuss the actual psychology of the pause. When you use summer baits, you are constantly moving. You cast, you reel, you pop the rod, you burn the bait back to the boat or the bank. It is an active, fast-paced game. Winter fishing with downsized baits requires a completely different mental state. It is all about the dead stick, the pause, the agonizingly long wait. You drop that tiny bait down into the strike zone. You give it one tiny little quiver, and then you completely stop moving. You hold completely still. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, sometimes an entire minute. To a fisherman used to summer action, this feels terribly boring. But to a cold water fish, a tiny bait just sitting there suspended in the water is the most irresistible thing in the world. It looks perfectly natural. They will stare at it for what feels like an eternity, calculating the energy cost. And right when you are about to lose your patience and move the rod, that is exactly when they gently suck it in. Patience pairs perfectly with small profiles. Color choices also become critical when you downsize in cold water. In the summer, fishermen love to throw massive, incredibly bright, obnoxious colors to generate shock value and reaction strikes, bright chartreuse, fire tiger, huge metallic flashes. But remember what we said about clear winter water. Visibility is at its absolute peak. If you drop a glowing, massive neon bait right onto the head of a lethargic, resting winter fish, you will instantly spook them. When you downsize your baits, you also need to tone down your color palette. You want to focus on incredibly natural, muted tones, translucent plastics, subtle browns, deep greens, and tiny flecks of black or silver. You want the bait to perfectly blend into the cold, stark winter environment. A tiny, translucent plastic creeping slowly along the bottom looks exactly like a small, aquatic insect trying to survive the freezing temperatures. By keeping the size small and the colors natural, you completely drop the guard of highly pressured, very nervous winter fish. Another crucial reason summer baits fail in the winter involves the thermocline and where the fish actually position themselves. In the dead of winter, fish will find very specific layers of water where the temperature is slightly warmer, sometimes right on the bottom or suspended at a very specific depth. Their comfort zone is extremely tight. If they are sitting in 15 feet of water, they might only be willing to move an inch or two to grab a meal. If you are aggressively ripping a huge summer bait up and down through the water column, you are constantly pulling it completely out of their tiny strike zone. They are not going to swim up 3 feet to chase your huge spoon, but with a tiny microbait you can meticulously lower it exactly to their level. You can hover it right in front of their nose and keep it in that microscopic strike zone for minutes at a time. Downsizing gives you surgical precision. You are no longer hoping they chase the bait. You are patiently serving the meal directly to them on a tiny silver platter. Even if you prefer using live bait, the exact same rules of downsizing apply. A lot of guys will buy massive night crawlers or giant scoops of minnows and try to fish them exactly like they do in June. They will thread a massive, thick worm onto a giant hook, leaving a huge glob of meat hanging off. In the summer, a fish will attack that whole glob. In the winter, a lethargic fish will just swim up, grab the very tail end of that massive worm, and gently pull it right off the hook without you ever feeling a thing. To fix this, you must aggressively downsize your live offerings. Cut that nightcrawler into a tiny 1-inch section. Better yet, switch to completely different, much smaller baits. A single wax worm, a single spike, or a tiny crappy minnow pinned on a micro hook is vastly superior to a massive glob of summer bait. Less bulk means there is absolutely nothing for the fish to short bite. If they decide to eat that single tiny spike, the hook is instantly inside their mouth. You also have to consider the severe weather fronts that roll through during the cold months. Winter fishing is constantly plagued by massive high-pressure systems. When a severe cold front hits, the barometric pressure skyrockets, the skies turn perfectly clear, and the fish completely lock their jaws. They develop negative feeding moods. During a postfrontal winter day, throwing a large summer bait is essentially a complete waste of your time. The fish are pinned to the bottom, highly stressed and absolutely refusing to eat anything substantial. This is when the micro-presentation becomes your only saving grace. When fish are in a highly negative mood, you have to annoy them into biting with a bait so small and unobtrusive that it does not threaten them. A tiny 1/64 ounce jig quivering delicately right in front of a locked-up walleye or panfish can eventually trigger a tiny, lazy reaction bite purely out of instinct. You cannot force-feed a postfrontal winter fish with a big bait, but you can definitely trick them with a tiny one. The final step to mastering the winter bite is a complete physical transition of your gear. It is not enough to just buy a few small jigs and keep them hidden in your pocket. You need to physically remove your heavy summer tackle boxes from your truck. Leave the giant crankbaits, the heavy spinnerbaits, and the massive swim baits sitting safely in your garage. If you bring them with you, the temptation to tie them on when the fishing gets tough will simply be too great. You will fall right back into your old habits. By committing strictly to a small box filled entirely with light line, microplastics, tiny tungsten jigs, and ultralight hooks, you force yourself to adapt to the cold water reality. You force yourself to slow down, to watch your line carefully, and to respect the severely slowed down metabolism of the fish you are chasing. It is a completely different style of fishing, but once you embrace the tiny details, you will suddenly find yourself pulling fish out of the ice or the freezing water while everyone else is complaining about the cold. So there it is, the absolute biggest reason you are freezing your toes off and going home without a single fish is sitting right there, tied to the end of your line. When the water turns to ice, the biology of the fish changes entirely. Their metabolism crashes, their energy levels plummet, and their desire to chase a massive summer meal completely disappears. The old rule of big bait equals big fish goes straight out the window when the temperature drops. The real secret, the massive turning point for your cold water success, is forcing yourself to downsize. Tiny microjigs, hair-thin line, incredibly slow movements, and ultimate patience are what trick these stubborn, lethargic giants into finally opening their mouths. Once you stop trying to feed them a huge steak and start offering them a helpless tiny snack, your entire winter fishing experience will change forever. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out with us today. If this video opened your eyes and gave you a new strategy for your next freezing trip, please hit that subscribe button to join the community. Do not forget to drop a like on the video, it helps us out massively. Now I want to hear from you. Head down into the comments and tell me, what is the absolute smallest bait you have ever caught a massive fish on? Let us read some great stories down below.